This is a companion piece to our previous episode about the Shelby Cobra, because this is a sequel. It's one of the most insane, dangerous, old-school supercars ever designed, certainly ever sold in the modern era as a mass-market vehicle. It humiliated the European exotics and showed everybody that not only could America make an insane supercar, they could best the Europeans not just at the track, not just on the drag strip, but at the pinnacle of motor racing itself. This is the Dodge Viper. Bob Lutz is one of the greatest minds to ever grace the Big Three. At Ford, he led the Sierra and Explorer projects. At GM, he imported the Holden Monaro as the Pontiac GTO and led to the creation of the Chevy Volt, Cadillac CTS, and the relaunched Camaro. And at Chrysler, he made the LH platform, but he had bigger plans in mind. And he was discussing some of them with his friend Tom Gale at Chrysler's Advanced Design Studio. Now, Gale had penned everything from the K-Car to the Lamborghini Diablo, and the two of them came up with an idea, a sequel to the Shelby Cobra, a no-frills sports car that was as light as possible with as big of an engine as possible. And a clay model was made before a sheet metal concept for the 1989 Detroit Auto Show. Now, Lutz happened to be friends with Chrysler president Lee Iacocca, but not good enough friends to greenlight production, despite immense public interest following the show. They would have to wait until funding was appropriated in 1990 to begin, and they started by assembling a crack team of 85 engineers for Team VIPER. And no Viper team would be complete without the brainchild of the car that inspired it, so Carroll Shelby was brought on as a consultant. And when the Dodge Viper launched, it wasn't the most sophisticated thing in the world, with canvas and vinyl being used for the roof and the windows respectively. Yeah, if you wanted to close your windows, you physically had to zip them up. And that's just the beginning of how little Gale gave a damn about his customers' safety and comfort. Because it had no air conditioning, no driver aids, no airbags, and the convertible didn't even have exterior door handles. But that meant it was light, just 3,300 pounds. Oh, that doesn't sound very light, except for the fact that it has a freaking truck engine in it. Since at the time, Chrysler owned Lamborghini and told them to make a sports car engine. So Lamborghini took the 5.9-liter Magnum V8 diesel engine from the Ram Power Wagon, added 2 cylinders to it, and cast it out of aluminum to make a V10. And thanks to 2 things, it was naturally aspirated instead of turbocharged, and the aluminum was stronger, Lamborghini could bore it out from 5.9 liters to a hilarious 8 liters of displacement. So in 1991, it made 400 horsepower and 465 torque at just 3,600 RPM. That made a sprint to 60 in 4.6 seconds and a quarter mile in 12.6. And with a clever chassis and suspension setup, it turned in at 0.96 G. But most people could never achieve that, since they were either killed in an accident or had a heart attack. Since it had so much torque across the entire rev range, if you hit the gas, well, no traction control and a 6-speed manual meant you would probably end up in the wall. They actually have a phrase for it. It's called the snake bite. But critically, before the customers died, they bought the car. Enough of them to justify a second generation in 1996. And similarly to the M3, the first generation was a raw driver's car, plain and simple, no frills, while the second gen saw it become an everyday sports car. The Viper was similar, but in the Viper's case, the creature comforts were things like door handles, and air conditioning, windows that didn't have zippers, and airbags. It still didn't have any electronic aids of any kind, and it still had a naturally aspirated V10 paired to a 6-speed manual. And since it had creature comforts, to some extent, Dodge decided to make an even more powerful version called the GTS. See, the RT-10 already had an aluminum suspension components and a reworked exhaust, but the GTS was even more focused than the RT-10, even down to the double bubble roof to fit the helmets. It also had a reworked engine with lighter and stronger pistons and a new camshaft to make 450 horsepower. And since it had more power, the GTS was fitted with stronger brakes and ABS. It was a true thrasher of European exotics, and yet Dodge knew there was more to extract. So enter the American Club Racer. The ACR took the family-friendly elements of the second generation and threw them away just like the first generation, leaving nothing but pure performance on the table. No air conditioning and no radio. But in their place was a 5-point racing harness, adjustable suspension, BBS wheels, and a revised air intake, boosting horsepower to 460. And it wasn't just a bookend to the second generation. It was a celebration of their GTS-R program. What the heck is the GTS-R program? Well, GTS is the sort of track-ish version, the sportier version of the RT-10, and the R in GTS-R, well, that stands for racing. Chrysler partnered with Oreca to run and maintain the racing team. Now, Oreca is a very successful French motorsport arm who have won countless LMP2 titles, a class win at the 2015 24 Hours of Le Mans, and an overall win at Le Mans with Mazda in 1991. Now, the first order of business is they didn't do much to the engine except make it more reliable, because it was already a very powerful race engine. And then for the bodywork, they simply added new aero elements to provide more cooling and increased downforce, which meant when they lined up on the 1996 grid, it was mixed success at best. You see, entering the GT1 class was a bad call. GT1 was starting to spiral out of control in the mid-90s, and their highest endurance finish was 10th at Le Mans. So they stopped competing against the hypercars of GT1 and moved to the supercars of GT2, and from there on out, nobody could touch it. Vipers won endurance races all over the world, including Fuji, Nürburgring, Spa, Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans, which it won 3 times in a row starting in 1998, including an outright win at the 24 Hours of Daytona in 2000. Even after factory programs ceased in 2001, Vipers continued to win national championships all the way to 2009. All in all, the GTS-R program won over 50% of the 262 races it entered, securing 23 constructors' titles and 24 drivers' titles, making it one of the most successful GT cars ever made. But that was the racing program. Let's get back to the road cars. The Century was new and Dodge wanted a whole new Viper to reflect it. So SRT gave it a whole new aggressive styling draped over a redesigned chassis that was both lighter and stiffer. But the biggest change was the engine. This is a new Viper, so it must get more power, per the rules. But the original engine was reaching its limits, so they did the most American thing possible, and bored it out from 8 liters to 8.3. That meant a naturally aspirated engine making 510 horsepower and 535 torque in 2003. It was faster than a Corvette Z06 to 100 miles an hour by almost an entire second, and it could outbrake a 911 GT2. And that sort of speaks to the overall quality of the performance of the Viper, because it was very grippy and could outturn that 911 GT2 on some tracks while we're on the subject. Now, it originally only came as a convertible, which makes that turning achievement even more impressive. But a coupe was added in 2005, and personally, this is my favorite Viper. It's the last of the truly analog cars. It's somehow road legal without any electronic safety net of any kind, and is my favorite looking of the whole saga. Then Viper went on a sabbatical for 2007 in preparation for the 4th gen. Now, it may look exactly the same, but the devil is in the details. Got a new gearbox with better synchronization. New Michelin Pilot Sport 2s complemented the new roll bars and springs. The exhaust was a more simplistic side exit design as opposed to the cross exhaust design, which reduced the heat in the cabin because the third generation had a cross. So the exhaust started on the left and finished on the right, and vice versa. That seems super cool, except for the fact that the cross happened directly underneath the cabin, which meant you were casseroled in the car. And that's not good. So they fixed it. But again, the biggest changes were done to the engine with the help of McLaren. They added dual throttle bodies, larger valves, new valve springs, and an electronic engine control unit that extended the red line by 300 RPM. All of that when combined with an increase to 8.4 liters, because when in doubt, go bigger, the Viper now made 600 horsepower. Unfortunately, it also released in 2008, and Chrysler had just gone bankrupt, and people simply weren't in the market for a ridiculously powerful, ridiculously dangerous supercar. So the 4th gen existed for just 2 years and ended production in 2010. But again, like the originals, they called upon the ACR for a send-off. Like the 1999, the 2010 ACR got fancy suspension and road-wheel racing tires and 60 pounds taken out of the weight. But the 2010 added even more ridiculous aero, making 1,000 pounds of downforce. And the use of carbon fiber and the two-way adjustable shocks made it one of the fastest track cars in the world. Sure, the aero cut the top speed down by 15 miles an hour, but with a braking distance 11 feet shorter than the standard Viper, and that downforce gluing it to the road, lap records were shattered. It broke the road car record at Laguna Seca before heading to the hollowed ground of the Nürburgring, where it did a 7-minute 11-second lap, which in 2010, the only thing faster was a Gumper Apollo, which cost 5 times as much. So Dodge did something that nobody asked for and made the ACR-X not road legal at all, which meant it had 40 horsepower more, a full roll cage and fuel cell, 120 pounds removed from the ACR, more downforce, and fully fledged racing slicks. And the options package reflected this, with an optional fire suppression system and a differential cooler. And it went 9 seconds faster than the already fast ACR around the Nürburgring. But FCA President Sergio Mastroianni, I think, was already getting the ball rolling for a 5th gen back in 2010, and 3 years later, that ball arrived. Now, new regulations plus a desire to reduce the risk of agonizing death meant that this was the most sensible Viper ever. It was now an actual car with Alcantara covering the interior, leather seats, and a full array of driver aids. But you still couldn't relax, because it still had a 6-speed manual mounted to the rear wheels, and at the front, they still had a 645 horsepower, 600 torque, naturally aspirated V10, which is still, to this day, the torquiest naturally aspirated engine ever built, a record that I don't see falling ever again. And side note, the engine is so strong that the core internals can be turbocharged up to 3,000 horsepower. That's just stupid. A 3,000 horsepower twin turbocharged rear wheel drive 6-speed manual race car that's road legal with a license plate. I love this country. And it's actually even more aerodynamic than ever. It's the fastest Viper, 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds, and a top speed of 207 without the crazy, ludicrous turbos. And it's yours for just $93,000 new. And there were a lot of variants. There was the Time Attack 1 and the Time Attack 2, which had racing shocks, fancy tires, and a mild downforce upgrade. But then there was the GTC program. It was a customization program that cost $120,000 each. But for that hefty starting price, you got access to over 8,000 colors, 24,000 different stripes, and literally thousands of interior and styling options. Now, using math of combinations and permutations, it was found that you could build over 25 million different Viper combinations. And once you ordered it, nobody else could ever build another one. It's completely unique and individual. It's like the Rolls-Royce of over-the-top supercars. But like the 4th gen, people just weren't buying them. That $93,000 asking price wasn't a generous thing done out of the kindness of their hearts. They were desperate to ship the things. The main issue was marketing. FCA did a horrible job branding the Viper. First, it was the SRT Viper by the separate company SRT. Then it was the Dodge Viper by Dodge. Then it was the Dodge SRT Viper, also sold by Dodge. It just got confusing and nobody bought them. It was already a niche supercar market, and, well, they just made it even more complicated. So, they brought out the ACR again for one hell of a white flag lap. Technically speaking, the 2017 ACR is the slowest Viper ever, with a top speed of just 177 miles an hour with the Extreme Aero package. On the upside, that package generates 2,000 pounds of downforce at speed. Then it has bigger 335 tires on the rear, 15.4-inch Brembo brakes on the front, and fully adjustable coilover suspension all around, and that made it unstoppable. In 2017, the Corvette Z06 could go through the skid pad at a phenomenal 1.19 G, and everybody thought it was the greatest thing on earth. And then the Viper went through the skid pad at 1.5 G. Around Virginia International Raceway, it bested a Ferrari 488 by a second. At Laguna Seca, it shattered the lap record, beating out the Porsche 918 hypercar, setting a goalpost of 128.65 that even a McLaren 765 Longtail couldn't beat. When it was all said and done, Dodge set 13 lap records, some of which still stand to this day. But they never made it to the Nürburgring. However, a group of privateers backed by former Le Mans racers took an ACR to the green hell in 2017. Now, they only got 3 attempts due to tire failure that sent the car into the wall. However, in that time, the ACR was certified at 7 minutes and 1.3 seconds. It was the 5th fastest road car ever at the time, and it's still the 12th fastest on record as of recording this video. And if you want to have an outright record, if you use the qualifications principle, it is still the fastest manual transmission ever around the Nürburgring. And if you've been following the history of the Viper throughout this video, you'll know that the ACR is always brought out as a send-off, if you will. And yeah, the Viper was killed off at the end of 2017 due to just abysmal sales. And I genuinely believe the Viper will never return. Certainly not in its historic state of massive engine, rear-wheel drive, and no sympathy. That's just the nature of the evolving auto industry, and frankly, I don't want the Viper to return, because it would likely be hampered by regulations, and I think it's better to send it out on a high than relaunch an inferior sequel. And let me tell you, those highs were truly stratospheric.